Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar in our series in exploring how we can assess opportunities and barriers for minority producers that are transitioning to climate smart and regenerative agriculture programs. We're so thankful that you could be with us today, and we have an excellent panel here for your discussion. So we'll wait a couple of moments to let folks come into the room. But just as an overview, we will have a dynamic discussion. We'll have a brief overview of the purpose of the webinars themselves, and then a really exciting facilitated discussion. And then we'll have time at the end for questions from the audience. I see a few more people trickling in, but for those coming in the room, as I mentioned, thank you so much. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Lakeisha Odom from FAR. We will hear from the other two hosts of our webinar series, and then we will have our panel discussion specifically focusing on cost-benefit analysis and economic discussion of the real cost for minority farmers to transition to climate-smart practices, and then Q&A. So I see a few more people trickling in. So I think we'll go ahead and at least start the discussion. So part of what we hope that we will accomplish with this webinar series is that we recognize that our minority producers are critical components of our nation's food security and land management and environmental stewardship pathways. We recognize that our minority producers are almost exclusively food producers. They grow crops and produce livestock to feed regional communities rather than growing larger commodity crops. Our minority producers tend to be smaller producers with more limited resources than their white counterparts, yielding ingenuity and deep understanding of their land, and yet they are severely underinvested across the country in the spectrum of public agricultural programs. But we also recognize there's an opportunity here as there is a growing interest from non-federal partners, such as our Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and RFF, in providing research, information, and support to our minority producers. So this particular panel will discuss the cost-benefit analysis and economic discussion for the real cost of our minority farmers in the transition in the climate smart practice space. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The first part of the dialogue are all the participants will be muted, and we ask that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A throughout the conversation, and we'll continue to encourage you to do that. There will be time again at the end for questions at the end of the presentations, and then we are recording, and we'll share this webinar with the registrants via email, and then also this webinar will be posted on the website with every other webinar recording for the series, so you'll be able to find all the webinars in one place at the end of this. So I think that the next step would be for me to share a little bit more about my organization for folks that are a bit less familiar with FAR, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and then I'll transition to my other two co-hosts, and then we will get to the fun part, which is the discussion. So for those folks less familiar with FAR, we create unique public-private partnerships, we connect funders, researchers, and the whole goal of that is to provide every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. We are an independent 501c3. We were created in the 2014 Farm Bill, and we create public investments to fill knowledge gaps and complement USDA's research agenda. We have awarded over 390 grants to date with 770 million funding, both funding partners, with our funded dollars and matched dollars, and we have over 550 distinct funding partners. The reason that we work in this space is that we recognize that for every dollar of agricultural research investment publicly generated, it will result in $20 of U.S. economic benefit. So there is a clear benefit to public research investment and U.S. economic benefit. We work across four key areas, cultivating thriving production systems, which includes crop and animal production system work, bolstering healthy food systems, which looks at things like food waste, food loss, health ag nexus, food nutrition, and urban farming and urban agriculture. Our sustaining vibrant agroecosystems covers soil health, which is my portfolio, sustainable water management, and climate. And then our fourth priority area is strengthening scientific workforce, as we recognize we need the next set of leaders to address the current and future challenges in our agricultural space. Now I will transition to one of our colleagues, Suzanne Russo, to share a bit more about RFF's mission, vision, and values. Suzanne?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Resources for the Future is delighted to be co-hosting this workshop series with Friedman Ayers Foundation and FAR. At RFF, our mission is to provide insights to policymakers on opportunities to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And we hold within that a priority to consider the equity and justice outcomes and implications of different policy approaches. Agriculture is a critical area of work for us at RFF, and we are delighted and honored by the conversations that are happening through these convenings. And I look forward to the discussion today, particularly as we focus in on the economic barriers and opportunities and innovative models that could be more broadly adapted to produce better, more effective policy in the agriculture sector. Thank you so much, Lakeisha and Seneca, for having us.
Thank you, Suzanne. And now I'll transition to Seneca Edwards Heron to share a little bit more about Friedman Ayers Foundation. But also, I'll just tell everyone in attendance this is Seneca's jam. She's an economist by training, so I'm really excited to see her moderate this panel.
Thank you so much. I am very excited, if you all cannot tell by the huge smile on my face. But my name is Seneca Edwards Heron, and I am the third person in this dynamic duo or this dynamic trio that has been fortunate enough to have the ability to bring these virtual convenings to the public. And so at Freeman Ayers Foundation, we are a nonprofit organization with a laser focus on expediting change in U.S. agriculture by bridging the gap between two worlds, Black farmers and the marketplace. We are dedicated to a vision of eliminating inequities in agriculture. Freedman Ayers, our mission and vision is to provide Black farmers with access to technical assistance, capital, and new market opportunities. Everything that we do at Freedman Ayers, we center it around the pillars, and the acronym stands for the acronym is trust. And that is transparency, respect, understanding, support, and transformation for the farmers, constituents, stakeholders, and everyone that we work with, including collaborators and our partners. We want to make sure that we are leveling the playing field for those producers that are so many times left out of conversations, don't have access to adequate resource, and wanting to make sure that those resources that are available are culturally competent and that they have an equity lens to them. So again, thank you, Dr. Odom. Thank you, Suzanne, for partnering with us and bringing these series of webinars to the public. So again, I will be the moderator for today, and we have an exceptional cast of panelists with us today, experts in this field. Again, I'm so excited around us bringing this economic conversation to the forefront. Excuse me. And one of the reasons I think is very important is that we are hearing so much talk around climate smart commodities, regenerative agriculture, organic, just anything that is considered non-conventional agricultural practices. And so much of that talk is around, oh, we need to push farmers to do this a different way. But no one is talking about the costs that are associated with changing from one production system to the next. There is a cost there. And even in that transition, the cost throughout the first several years where you may not see the same number or level of yields. There are indirect costs as well as direct costs. If we're thinking about different types of certifications, those are all things that need to be taken into consideration. And so that's kind of the premise around this. And we also wanted to bring this conversation to the forefront for researchers as well as government so that there is a clear understanding when making decisions and creating different types of programs that are geared toward bringing that support level to marginalized communities and BIPOC communities and agricultural practices as a whole. So I am so happy to have this panel with us today. I'll give just a brief intro because we'll get to know them a little bit more as they talk about their respective organizations and some of the things that they're doing in this area. So we have with us Dr. LaPortia Collins, who is a professor at Tufts University. We have with us David Lazax from Food System 6, Mark Muller from Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, and Conda Mason from Jubilee Justice. We're going to start off our conversation today with Dr. LaPortia Collins, and she's going to talk to us about economic models and financial tools around the transition and what that cost structure could look like. And so at this particular time, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. LaPortia Collins. Again, I would like to make sure I reiterate everything that Dr. Odom mentioned, and that we are encouraging everyone, if you have questions, we are going to get to them, but we're encouraging everyone to make sure that you put them in the chat. And then we will, at the end, have time to bring the questions to the panelists. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Collins.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Seneca, for that introduction. I am the Freeman School Professor of Nutrition Equity and an assistant professor at Tufts University. Today, I'll be discussing the economics of transitioning to regenerative agricultural practices. The outline of my presentation will cover just a brief overview of regenerative ag practices. I'll give a snapshot of some factors influencing adoption decisions. I'll discuss some economic principles underlying those adoption decisions and provide some insight into some practical tools for decision making. So regenerative agriculture is, in a nutshell, an approach to farm management that focuses mainly on improving soil health through various practices such as adaptive grazing, no-till planting, no or limited use of pesticides and synthetic fertilizer. So regenerative agriculture focuses on these 6 principles that you see on the screen, with the 4 in the center being soil health principles, ideally improving soil health through minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, and maintaining living root year round. One key principle of regenerative agriculture is the idea of understanding the context of your farm operation. So this is a very individualized approach. There are many different practices that fall under regenerative ag. Sometimes you will hear them referred to as falling under conservation agriculture or even agroforestry. These terms are similar, but they do not necessarily all fall under regenerative agriculture. But whenever you're looking for data on regenerative ag, a lot of times you will see data for conservation ag practices such as cover cropping, no-till, split-till, reduced tillage, and those types of practices, because there's limited data in general on the adoption rates of some of these practices and also on the effects of those practices. One example of this was if we look at the U.S. Census of Agriculture from 2017 to 2022, we would be able to see how those adoption rates have changed over those two years of the census. But that census data mainly focuses on these conservation ag practices such as cover cropping, which we've seen increases in the area of cropland farmed of 17% from 2017 to 2022. And we've seen only moderate or slight changes with respect to no-till and reduced tillage. And of course, we can also see the number of farms changing with respect to those farms that are adopting these practices as well. So there's some literature with respect to what factors are influencing these regenerative agricultural practices. One of the key factors that comes into play would be the cost or the profitability of these particular practices. So farmers consider the effect of adoption on their costs and returns. As I mentioned before, data on this is rather limited, but some research suggests that there are positive effects or positive returns to reduced tillage over conventional tillage practices, for example. With cover cropping, the evidence is a lot more mixed, where we see that cover cropping can be profitable, but as Seneca mentioned earlier, negative returns may occur, especially early on. And we also find that cover cropping may be more profitable if combined with other practices such as grazing and tillage. So we have some evidence of profitability or improvements in returns when we incorporate these practices, but the results are mixed and they depend on the type of farm, the type of soil structure, and of course, the experience of the farmer. Some additional research has been done conducting a systematic review of studies looking at factors influencing adoption, particularly in this case on reduced tillage practices. Profits again come up as a key factor, but other factors such as how will the adoption affect government payments? How is it going to affect the farmer's yields? Will it ultimately affect whether or not the farmer maintains access to their land? These are important factors that have come up consistently within the literature, in addition to some non-monetary factors, such as the farmer's perceptions of soil health and whether they believe that introducing these practices into their farm will actually improve soil health, the farmer's risk aversion, and then also their desire for soil stewardship or promoting environmental health. So economics can help us to better understand these adoption decisions that farmers are facing. So here I have 5 economic principles that tend to come up whenever we're thinking about regenerative ag practices. The first is recognizing that farmers face scarce resources. They have limited incomes, limited land, and limited capital. And so this drives the need to consider trade-offs when making those decisions. So each decision that a farmer makes is going to have an opportunity cost associated with it. And in economics, opportunity cost simply means the next best alternative. Many times farmers forget to take into account unpaid labor. So that unpaid labor has an opportunity cost associated with it. You could be doing something else with your time versus making these production changes on your farm. And so the value of that is going to be considered when you're thinking about the benefits and costs of adopting these practices. The other thing that we tend to look at are incremental changes. We won't try to change the world in one shot per se, but making incremental changes and taking things step by step is one thing that farms can do. And that we call marginal thinking, right? So we're going to compare the marginal benefits or the additional benefits that we expect to receive from adopting these practices to the additional costs that we expect to face. So it's twofold. We have to consider the benefits and also the costs. If the benefits of adopting the practice don't exceed the cost of doing so, then economics would tell us that this is not something that we should pursue or that we should take additional considerations. Another principle is this idea of externalities. So a lot of the push behind regenerative ag practices is revolving around contributions to the environment, right? So we understand that our actions may affect others, but we don't always take that into account, right? So if you're adopting these regenerative agricultural practices, you may also be impacting others in your community through improvements in or reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or improvements in water quality. So your decisions are not only affecting the farm, but it's also affecting the community around you. And so this is one reason why we see that there are government programs and grant programs and things of that nature related to regenerative ag and climate smart practices, because they know that individuals may respond to incentives. And those incentives are to get us to account for some of those external benefits or costs associated with regenerative ag practices that we may not have previously considered before. So today I have 3 practical tools for decision-making when determining whether or not you're going to adopt a particular regenerative ag practice, the most important of which will be partial budgeting, and I'll spend the most time on that. And I'll very briefly mention enterprise and capital budgets. So partial budgets is a tool that helps you think incrementally. It will give you an idea of the benefits and costs associated with a specific incremental change to the farm enterprise. For example, if you're thinking about incorporating a different production practice such as no-till, or maybe you're thinking about adding another product to the product mix to diversify your farm. The benefit of using a partial budget is that it compares the alternative that you're considering to your current practice, and it's focusing only on the aspects that would change. So this is incorporating that economic principle of marginal or incremental thinking. So the core structure of a partial budget looks similar to this. You're going to compare your benefits, which includes any additional revenues you expect to get from the practice, and any costs that you expect to reduce. So if the practice would reduce some of your costs, that's seen as a benefit, right? So that's something that you no longer have to pay for. And on the cost side, you're going to include any additional costs, the cost of additional machinery, et cetera, and any revenues that you may reduce as a result of taking on this practice. For example, if you are no longer going to produce a certain product, the revenues that you would have gained but now have lost would be considered in that cost column. So when looking at this, we would want to compare the total benefits to the total costs. And if the total benefits exceed the total cost, then that would imply that incorporating this practice is going to improve the income overall. So this is an example of a partial budget from a farm in Ohio. So I just want to point out just a few things. The first is that it's very similar to the structure that I pointed out. There can be increases in net income. This is our benefit side, and decreases in net income would be our cost side. So some of the benefits of incorporating no-till, cover crops, and nutrient management, which is what this farm was able to do, would be improvements in their yield due to soil health practices, reductions in the amount of pesticides that they may have to incorporate, reduce machinery costs because they're reducing the amount of tillage, and then also reductions in field repair costs, perhaps associated with repairing soils from erosion and things of that nature. On the cost side, what we can see is that there will be increased costs associated with soil testing, because now you're focusing on soil health. Learning activities may come into play so that you can gain efficiency in applying the practices, and then also cover crop costs. So this is implementation costs. Ultimately, what we want to see is the comparison between the total benefits that we get from incorporating these practices and the total costs that we would incur from incorporating them. Ideally, we would see that the benefits will outweigh the cost. And using this partial budgeting example, you can focus directly on the benefits and costs that would be impacted by the practice and see your overall return on investment. Of course, the accuracy of any such partial budgeting analysis depends on the data that you incorporate in it. So if there's some data that you're not sure about, you can incorporate sensitivity analysis, modifying those particular variables to see how that would impact your ultimate returns. Scenario analyses would also be helpful in case you are aware of some particular threats to your business. For example, drought may come into play, and you can see how that might affect your numbers as well. Enterprise budgets is another tool. However, enterprise budgets look at all the costs and all the returns associated with a particular enterprise or product that you're producing. So it involves more data, but it also gives you a better idea of the overall profitability of incorporating a particular practice. And it tends to include 4 key sections: your returns, variable inputs, which tend to change based on your output, fixed costs, which you incur whether or not you produce output, and then the returns associated with that. So these enterprise budgets have a lot more information. That's the benefit of it, in that you get a more holistic picture. The downside is that you have to really look closely to see, when you're incorporating these practices, which costs and which returns are going to be the most impacted. So it's a little bit harder to see the direct impact of that particular change in the business. Regenerative agricultural practices tend to have returns that take place over time, which is not necessarily accounted for with partial budgeting or even with enterprise budgets. So capital budgets is an example of, if you wanted to take into account the fact that, hey, you may not get the return until year 5, but you would really rather that return today. So the value or time value of your money needs to be taken into account, and we consider that a discounting practice. So with discounting, we see that on the right-hand side, we have an investment that, say, is expected to yield us $350 in cash flows each year. But if we take into account the fact that the value of money that we will get tomorrow is going to be worth less to us over time, then we see that our true net present value of this investment is going to be lower than what we originally expected. So capital budgets, it's a little bit more complicated, but allows you to take into account the fact that this is sort of a multi-year investment that you're making in your business. So there are many online resources that are available, most of them through ag extension agencies. I have some listed here. Many of them are interactive, and I can provide links to those as well. So the key takeaways are that the economic effects of transitioning to regenerative farming practices varies across farms and over time. The expected returns are typically delayed, especially for cover cropping, unless you're addressing a specific production challenge or combining it with a different production practice. Marginal thinking, thinking incrementally, not trying to incorporate all the practices at once, but perhaps considering a few, is an economic concept that can help with respect to thinking about adoption, and partial budget analysis is perhaps the most important tool for getting started in making these decisions.
Thank you, Dr. Collins. What a very insightful presentation. And I think the way you crafted your presentation brings to why it is so important for us to pay more attention to the economic side and how that really impacts farmers. Because at the end of the day, farmers want to know, is this going to help me to be profitable, to make money? And the benefits definitely have to outweigh the cost. And then also thinking about the budgets. And I think that's where we, as ag economists, extension, both at 1890s and 1862s, and other researchers can provide support to producers in helping them to understand those budgets and crafting those budgets for their particular farming operation, depending upon what type of regenerative practice they want to take on, so that they can actually see the dollar amount and make the best decision for their farming operation. This idea of one size fits all for all farms and all producers, we really have to get out of that mindset and make sure that we are working towards making each producer uh, have a clear understanding of what these different challenges could mean for them in a dollar amount. So I'm super excited, as you all can tell by Dr. Collins' presentation, and thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to talk with Dr. David Sachs. And in his background as an environmental scientist and financial activist, he's also the managing director of Food System 6. And the discussion here will be around, we've talked about the economic side, and now I think we should shift gears in thinking about funding opportunities and alternative financial instruments that BIPOC farmers can actually. And Dr. Lee Zaks, I want to just kick off with one question for you.
Absolutely.
And we can, you can answer it in the way that you see fixed, but what are what are some promising financial instruments that are currently available for minority producers as we talk about this transition?
Absolutely. Great question. And I'll certainly touch on that. And I think some of the other themes that have already started to emerge as part of this discussion. And I think that the way that you've already begun to set up this discussion about, let's talk about the economics. I think it's really important to remember that, agriculture and farming and, foods and food brands, fundamentally are they're businesses. And it's important to consider them. And even within today's kind of late stage capitalistic system that we live in and we're a part of, we also have to remember that there are many different types of outputs to agriculture. Some that today's markets value, and some that today's markets don't value. That maybe we need additional support, whether from government, philanthropy, and other businesses, to begin to really integrate the broader value of, or the values and value that are generated from agroecological and regenerative agricultural approaches that may not be really appreciated by today's market actors. And really just helping to build and maybe even broaden how we're talking about regenerative agriculture and agroecology, and beginning to think about some of the community economic development returns, in addition to again, I come from a environmental science background, so I have I've stepped into or I started really framing my work over the past 20 plus years in let's look at agriculture from an environmental lens. But when you go to the places and talk with the people and look at the landscapes and those that are really looking at agriculture as a way to steward these landscapes, very quickly we are able to broaden this, I would say, the set of, or one set of regenerative agriculture metrics that are used that are primarily focused on soil health, and begin to look at, how much of that capital is recycling within that community. How is the resilience of that landscape and the people who live on that landscape? How is that improving? Let's start to look at the improved nutritional qualities of the food that's coming from healthy soil and how that's impacting the people who eat that food. And to me, and some of the projects and colleagues that we work with, taking a much more holistic approach to what regenerative agriculture and agroecology means and how we apply it, gets us to think about not only today's agricultural businesses and farms, but how we want these types of agricultural businesses and farms to operate in, what comes after capitalism, and how we begin to kind of shift the biophysical rules and laws that aren't going to change into the or into the kind of human-made laws and rules and regulatory systems that we know can change, and to begin to really merge those two systems, the biophysical and the human ones, into what we know is going to really work for society in the long term. And getting into the, I think that what the core of the conversation and discussion here around moving from the economics of, we know that in some cases some of these practices, some of these approaches, and whether it's everything from cover crops to more perennialization to creating more or growing more culturally appropriate crops, is that the access to capital to do those things is inherently what may be the decision point between whether a farmer or land steward is going to be able to do that or not going to be able to do that. And there are many, many, many examples of places where racism, sexism, discrimination with some types of lenders has prevented some of these, especially climate smart, regenerative agroecological practices from really being adopted in many places. And there are many lawsuits that have been brought forward, especially on the federal side, and many other cases that have been documented across the literature and in many locations, both in the U.S. and elsewhere, that has really prevented some of this capital from flowing. And it's important to look at kind of the broad um, range of capital sources that are currently supporting agriculture, everything from the government sources like Farm Services Agency, and then you look at farm credit, local banks, CDFIs, which are great and growing resources, community development financial institutions, of which I see there are some represented on the call today. And then where I think I'll spend a little bit more time in my discussion is really around this emerging ecosystem of alternative lenders. And this ecosystem, and this is primarily where me and many of my colleagues work, is that the organizations, or at least the types of organizations that I listed that are the primary providers of credit and capital across U.S. agricultural and food systems, really serve today's, I would say, production with the quantity focused production, commodity focused production systems in today's landscape. And they do a fabulous job at doing that and providing timely credit, appropriate credit for those types of systems. And in some cases, many of which we've been able to document and to really see, is when you go outside of that conventional commodity system, many of the existing capital sources are unaware, uneasy, unfamiliar with some of these other approaches. And you add on to that some of the cultural aspects, and we really see what is emerged as a mismatch between those who are seeking capital and those who have capital to lend and to invest in some of these operations. And when we look at kind of again, going back to these outcomes of these more regenerative systems, is and those that are much more closely tied to um, biological and ecological foundations, really the question that we find ourselves and many of our partners asking is how do we begin to match the type of capital and the capital mechanisms that are being used to promote those and support those kinds of systems to really match the biology and the economics and finance vehicles that are being used. And so we broadly kind of look at patient, flexible, and non-extractive capital as some of the really the hallmarks that we see as needing to kind of enter in and to reshape this next financial system that we're working on building. I think the first two are a little bit more self-explanatory in terms of patient and flexible. We realize that we're working within biological and ecological systems, and we all know that the weather's becoming a little bit more unpredictable, and that even if you're lucky enough and whatever you're doing fits into kind of current, at least federally subsidized crop insurance, sometimes the weather doesn't go as what you need to produce the value of a crop or livestock or other farm output to pay for the farm operations. And so how can lenders really adapt the tools that they're using to, again, really match some of this, unpredictability and really help to build in resilience? And then we get to this idea of what non-extractive capital means. And this is a relatively new term. And, from a definitional perspective, it is where the lender doesn't make more money than the entity or the person that's borrowing the money. And so this is really at its core a wealth building strategy, especially those that have faced historical discrimination. And we see, again, from a capitalist perspective, usually those that have the capital are doing their activities to make the most money. And here we're really trying to reverse the script here and really using kind of these transitions to more regenerative and ecologically focused agriculture to help build not only wealth in the landscape and in the soil, but in the people who are tending those systems and those ecosystems. Um, and over the past 20 years, entrepreneurs, some of which have come from the financial sector, some of which have come from the agricultural sector, have really begun to stand up an entire ecosystem of alternative financial providers. And those have emerged because there's been a market need for those, where there have been farmers that have been in need of land, operating capital, infrastructure, development of brands, supply chains, the whole, from farm to table or even farm to institution, a specialized type of capital that's been needed to kind of meet the goals of these more diversified and sometimes smaller scales, and couldn't find the appropriate capital vehicle or capital mechanism that was going to allow them to do that and to do it profitably. And this is where we've seen the kind of the innovation engine of the alternative and regenerative agricultural capital kind of ecosystem really began to emerge. Starting I think with some of these land funds back. I think the earliest ones were really, started coming online around 2007, 2008. To today, it seems that every time I open my inbox, there's, or maybe not every day, but every couple of months, there's a new fund, a new financial entity or mechanism that has emerged to really serve this need. And some of them have a specific focus on whether it's indigenous farmers, broader BIPOC farmers, farmers of color, to who really are doing this to create connection, to build wealth, and to really help to broaden um, and help some of these producers, whether it's feed their communities, to build wealth, and to identify some of these other values that are really important for both these sources of capital and for the growers and communities themselves. And that's where we're seeing that, in many cases where loans, except for real estate loans, of course, are able to be structured in ways that can be multi-year, can be flexible, are structured so that the those that are doing the hard work on the ground are able to make more money from these transactions than the lenders themselves. And what we see as kind of the next step, and where some of our work in this is kind of activating in now and in these next couple of years, is how do we create the financial infrastructure that the conventional agricultural system has and enjoys, everything from loan guarantees to bridge loans to insurance mechanisms and more, that conventional agriculture enjoys, but that this kind of alternative finance ecosystem doesn't yet have. And that's where some of our core work in partnership with Mark and some of Kanta's partners as well is really helping to build the mycelial networks that support the not only the farmers but the capital providers. And at this point, it is primarily um, foundations, impact investors. There are some forms of government capital coming in to support this, whether directly through USDA, and there are some mechanisms through Farm Credit that are supporting some of these as well. And it's really exciting for me to see the growth of kind of this broader ecosystem. As an example, in 2019, the first Regenerative Food System Investment Forum was held in Oakland, California. It sold out at about 125 people attending that event. This past October, the room was sold out at almost 500 people. And so this is, just an example of the number of farmers, food brands, investors, philanthropists who have really converged and come together to really help to build and to grow this ecosystem, to provide the more appropriate forms of capital that especially the historically underserved farmers and food producers have experienced and willing to step up to ensure that access to capital and access to appropriate capital is not what's holding them back to really moving forward on some of these climate smart transitions and transformations.
Well, thank
Did I
you,
answer
Dave.
your question?
You did. You did. And this is exciting. And I hope the audience is seeing where we're going. We're starting off on economics. And then we segued into, okay, let's look at finance and what are some alternative financial mechanisms. And you mentioned, David, the current ag lending or credit system that we have. And it's not conducive to a lot of the production practices of smallholder farmers or historically marginalized farmers. So the work that you're doing is very important in that it brings out these alternative systems and provides alternative opportunities for these farmers to be successful in the work that they're trying to do. And even also, if you look at it in a broader sense, when farmers are successful, communities are successful and they're stronger. And you mentioned, even talking to the point about access to healthy food. All of these things are intertwined and intermingled. And I think it's important that we look at it in a holistic manner instead of trying to look at everything so segmented and in a silo. I think that's where a lot of the work that I have been reading is very segmented, and we really have to start thinking about things in a more holistic manner. Now, we're going to segue again, and we are going to talk about the role of philanthropy and how philanthropy can also help with thinking about the opportunities to support minority producers as they transition to more regenerative and climate smart production practices. And we are going to have with us Mr. Mark Muller. I want to get it right, sure that I am saying it right. The Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, where he serves as the executive director.
Thank you. Excuse me while I try to figure out how to get the appropriate view here. Slideshow. Okay. Well, I apologize. I'm a mess here. Okay. Is that showing up okay?
I think if you go to the bottom right of your screen, you should see where it'll allow you to make it. Yeah, right there.
Things happening when I press it. Uh, um, well, geez, I don't know. Is this showing up okay?
Sure, we
Perhaps if
can.
you click presenter view at the
Presenter view.
top, to the left a little bit, the third one from the left.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. All
Sure.
right. Well, that's a great way to start. Hi, I'm Mark Muller, as Seneca mentioned. I'm with the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation. I'm based in Minnesota. A couple things I wanted to mention. One is just, yeah, I'm going to kind of provide a little bit of a foundation perspective. Um, so I've worked for several years for a large family foundation called McKnight Foundation, and for the past several years for the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, which is an intermediary funder. So just to give the two-sentence description of them, the family foundations that you may have heard of, like Kellogg Foundation and Ford Foundation, they are large endowed foundations that tend to have often billions of dollars in their endowment, and they are required by law to distribute 5% of their endowment each year. So that has been a source of some great funding to have some great initiatives going forward. I am now part of the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation, and we're an intermediary funder where we receive grants from some of those large foundations, and we distribute that to smaller on-the-ground organizations. The majority of our funding goes through participatory grant-making processes, which means that we have community members to help make the decisions on where the funding goes. And I'm proud to say that well over 50%, probably closer to 70% of our grants are now going to Black, Indigenous organizations of color that are either on the ground doing great regenerative work and or also doing policy advocacy work. So that's where I'm coming from. I also want to mention on the left there, I have three photos of people that I've really felt like have mentored me quite a bit. Malik Yakini from Detroit, Don Bustos from northern New Mexico, and Valerie Segrest with the Muckleshoot tribe in Washington State. They were all fellows. I used to direct a fellowship program called the Food and Community Fellows. And these were all fellows in that program. And I would say, they gained from the program in terms of releasing their time for them to be creative in their energies. And for me, it was such a transformative experience in learning that there are other ways of producing food than what I grew up with and what I knew. And I think that is such a critical component about what we are doing here, is realizing that we need to get outside maybe some of the dominant paradigms to look at something different. And in that dominant paradigm, we have a pretty dangerously fragile landscape. And I'm showing you the landscape up here in the upper Midwest, where you see the yellow is corn and the green is soybeans. And you'll see there isn't a whole lot else on that map except for corn and soybeans. We have many counties, particularly like south central Minnesota and north central Iowa, that are over 90% corn and soybeans. That's even including the roads and the buildings and other things. They're over 90% corn and soybeans. It's a stunning high percentage in just a couple of crops. And in that lower right-hand corner, you'll see a photo of a cornfield in early spring, and you see that there isn't much cover there. The vast majority of our fields are not having regenerative cover cropping, minimizing tillage, things like that. And we have a whole lot of issues that result from that in terms of the water quality issues, the soil health issues, the biodiversity, ownership disparities, the health. There are many things that are there. So I want to emphasize that we wholeheartedly feel that it is necessary, and there's great work that's going on to grow these main crops better, being corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, cotton. We can do a much better job of growing them regeneratively. And also, I think there's a real need for thinking outside of this box and getting to more of a, I would say, decolonized view outside of the dominant paradigm of how else we can grow our food. And I think that the three people I mentioned earlier are three examples of that. One of the dangers, I would say, of having too linear a thinking about what we're doing is that we can do very well on a couple of different metrics. And for example, we've had for the past 60 years, I would say we've had a emphasis on growing cheap and abundant food, or I say cheap and abundant commodities. And we've generally done quite well with it. And this is actually a friend of mine who's farming in Southeast Iowa. And one of those years where they just had a fantastic year and corn was booming and they just had to lay a lot of it on the ground. There's a danger if we do not recognize that we need to have a more holistic perspective and we can't just narrow it down to a couple of things. I see that particularly in the climate world. And I think one of the best opportunities that we have in terms of getting more funding to help support the transition for minority farmers, as this webinar is about, is coming from the climate space. And there's also the danger that the climate space thinks so much about a couple of different metrics, such as greenhouse gas emission reduction. And that's a very important metric, and we need to be advancing on that. But we can somewhat lose the forest for the trees at times. And I just think these big heaping mounds of corn are an example of what can happen if we miss the forest for the trees. Someone I've worked with for a good 25 years, this is Reginaldo Hazlet Matakin, who is in Northfield, Minnesota, about 45 minutes south of me here in Minneapolis. And he has an amazingly diverse farm and a whole network of farms that he's working with that are, the emphasis of it is having chickens underneath a canopy of elderberries and hazelnuts and other crops in terms of like stacking multiple sources of income in a regenerative way. It is so different from what we see on the left-hand side where I have that cornfield again. And the challenge, I think, one of the challenges that we have in front of us is that we have pretty good data on what are the greenhouse gas benefits of going to a more of a cover crop system, of minimizing tillage on a row crop field. We do not have very good data at all for the incredible diversity work that Rehi's doing on his farm. And so we tend to value what we measure. And if we can value the tweaks to the dominant system, we can often miss the really, truly visionary work that's going on outside of that. So I just, that as we need to have both. We need to work on all those things. But we at the Regenerative Agriculture Foundation are really trying to emphasize and focus on how do we make it work for those visionaries and those people that are kind of stepping outside of the normal ways. And one way of doing that is really trying to embrace traditional ecological knowledge, as one of our grantees, Makoche Ag in South Dakota and the Pine Ridge is doing, of really recognizing that there are tremendous environmental benefits, there's tremendous community development benefits that can come from systems that are often grounded in traditional ecological knowledge. So to get to the root of what some of the work that we've been doing, we had this report that came out about 10 months ago. This is climate resilience. And what we did is we highlighted the work of several of our grantees in a program that we call Restoring Regenerative Agriculture. And the restoring concept is that we have some stories of regenerative agriculture that we know well. And I always think about Gabe Brown, as I'm sure many are familiar with, just a brilliant farmer doing wonderful things on regenerative agriculture. And we have not heard enough about some of the brilliant work that's being done in other races and ethnicities regarding regenerative agriculture. And so my colleague, Brett Ramey, he's with the Iowa Tribe of Kansas, Nebraska. He's one that kind of had this vision for this program that we call Restoring Regenerative Agriculture, which uses a participatory grant-making concept of having 5 leaders of color from around the country that decide on 15 organizations that will receive a small grant. This year will be $36,000 for just doing great work outside of the dominant culture. And we're just going to have our 3rd round of restoring recipients. This in the next month, we'll be announcing it in January. But as a way of recognizing that regenerative agriculture can be found in many different places, and often it's in places that we are not thinking of as regenerative agriculture. The 3 icons I have in the lower right-hand corner are 3 of the recipients of restoring funds that were highlighted in this climate resilience report, but just essentially saying that this work is done and must be recognized in so many different parts of the country and in so many different cultural backgrounds. So that's one of the programs that I have that I'm particularly proud of. And then another one that I'm thrilled that David is a close partner with, it's called the SHOT Fund, and it's for soil health opportunities and tools. And the idea behind this was essentially that with our partners at the Rural Climate Partnership, we were seeing that there was an awful lot of opportunity coming out of USDA and other federal agencies that not enough of the grantees that we were working with were pursuing. And for me, this really started with the partnership of Climate Smart Commodities and seeing that there was a lot of opportunity there and a lot of people that were quite intimidated by the amount of work it took to apply for a grant and then the amount of administrative burden it has and those other things. So we kind of started this a few years ago, providing small grants to organizations to have them submit for a federal grant. And we did that with the Partnership of Climate Smart Commodities. We did that with the USDA Access to Land Capital Markets. We've done it with RCPP. We've done it with the SARA grant. We've done this with a variety of different opportunities that USDA has. And I'm really proud to say that several of them have hit for millions of dollars. The Rehi that I mentioned earlier, his group, the Regenerative Ag Alliance, was successfully received $5 million in the Partnership of Climate Smart Commodities that we helped support. I think a learning that I've had and many others have learned is just like receiving, successfully applying for the grant is the first of many different barriers that organizations face, particularly organizations that are not with that experience and maybe not as well endowed to deal with the time it takes to get reimbursed by USDA and other things like that. So we're trying to do a more of a wraparound support for organizations, providing help for the administrative work, helping fill in some of the holes that inevitably happen that what the federal government will not cover. So I'm proud to say that we've been distributing quite a bit of money over the past year now that we've really become formalized, and are hoping to keep on taking advantage of forthcoming opportunities at USDA, as well as think about other places. I think it's widely thought that there will not be as many opportunities at USDA over the next 4 years. They will still be there. And so we are still going to be working there, as well as exploring a little bit more at state-based opportunities, different opportunities with supply chain type of work. So I encourage anyone on this call that is kind of interested in this, I'll give my email momentarily, to contact me and I'd love to talk about this. We are right now really focused on the Midwest. I'm trying to do more in the Southeast and doing more and more in California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And last thing I'm going to give a quick shout out with David is that one of the opportunities that we're really trying to figure out is the EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, is one of the key conservation tools at USDA. It's a reimbursement process. And so if a farmer is trying to implement a $50,000, say, conservation practice, they have to put the money up front, and then after the whole thing is completed, they can get the money back from USDA. We're trying to figure out how to make it so that they don't have that hole where either they have to borrow money from a bank or just can't do the project at all. We're trying to provide no interest EQIP loans to kind of help bridge that gap so we have more farmers that are able to participate in programs such as EQIP at USDA. And I think that's all I have. And my email is there. And I do encourage you to please write me if you would be interested in kind of exploring some of these opportunities, and looking forward to the forthcoming conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, for shining a light on philanthropy's role, and also by leading by example with your organization and what you're all doing with the SHOP Fund. And I'm intrigued, so I'll be talking to you later after this panel discussion, but about what you're thinking about EQIP and how you're looking at that as a potential opportunity. And that's the first that I've heard of an organization, philanthropy-wise, looking at something like that. So I think that it's very important, as you mentioned, throughout the next administration and beyond, for us to be more innovative in our approach to making sure that opportunities are provided for everyone. And I think that some of the examples that you provided for us, it gives us a lot to think about and ways that we can kind of piggyback off of that. Now, I want to change the discussion a little bit and look at it from the perspective of someone who has a little bit of experience in everything that we've already previously talked about, on, looking at it from the economic side as a producer, but also working in the landscape of philanthropy and also working with producers. We have with us Conda Mason, who is a social entrepreneur and founder and president at Jubilee Justice. And she's doing some great things at Jubilee Justice. If you all haven't heard, she's doing some great and wonderful, innovative things with rice production down there in Louisiana. That's very, very intriguing. I think is, kind of the best way to look at rice when you're thinking about non-conventional production practices of rice and ways that it can be expandable and also beneficial for farmers, smallholder farmers particularly, who want to get into the rice industry. So without further ado, I will pass the conversation over to Ms. Mason.
Thank you. Wow, I'm learning so much from this panel, and I'm so excited. Each of you have said so much that I will follow up on. And what you were just saying, you were really hitting it on the nail on the head with a lot of your observations and similar to mine and my work. So Jubilee Justice, we are as Seneca said, we are located in Louisiana, central Louisiana. And and we have we are doing rice. We are growing rice in a different way in something called the System of Rice Intensification, SRI, that is came out of Madagascar and is being promoted through technical assistance through Cornell University, which is my partner on the project. And it is a climate-friendly way of growing rice, as well as we're doing. So it's in the thick of what one would consider regenerative agriculture and organic. It's organic and regenerative, and so and that's the other thing that there's so many definitions around regenerative, and a lot of regenerative still use chemicals. And people think that, like, if I'm regenerative, do I have to also be organic? The answer to me is yes. If you're organic, should you be regenerative? The answer to me is yes. It's like, there's the plant, there's the concern of the plant, which is organic, is really concerned about the plant, and regenerative is more concerned about the soil. And the two, as far as I'm concerned, are very interdependent, obviously, and important to do it in ways that are healthy for the entire ecosystem, including our guts, right? Our absolute everything that we eat and the ecosystem that's under the earth, the symbiotic relationship. And so, I guess I was going to talk more about some of the socioeconomic impacts of going regenerative. So I work with farmers throughout the Southeast, Black farmers. And Jubilee Justice is a nonprofit, and we have put together a cooperative of Black farmers, all learning how to do this rice in this particular way. And we're in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And we have farmers throughout, and all Black farmers. And age difference, we have the older farmers, the average age of a Black farmer is around 61 years old. And we have all the way to the 80s, in their 80s. And we have others that are in their 30s. And there is a difference between their approaches to farming, which is interesting. The younger farmers are absolutely more leaning towards less chemicals and being more regenerative in their farming practices. They're not interested as much. Some of the younger farmers, I got another family of all young farmers, and they're really dedicated to chemicals. But by and large, and then there's the older farmers who are typically, doing a lot of chemical production. But it's interesting because when we first talk to them, when we first come on the scene, one of the first questions we ask them is like, after how did you get your land? How long have you been here? What is the cultural heritage of the land? Then we talk about, well, how did your grandfather or your father, how did they farm? And they get this smile and they talk about natural farming. And they go, oh yeah, they farmed naturally, which is what we are calling this regenerative farming. And so we then go into the history of course, George Washington Carver, where is the basis of what we call regenerative agriculture, came from the man after emancipation, and looking at what cotton had done to the soil, and him coming up with everybody think of him as a peanut, but we're talking about legumes, we're talking about nitrogen, we're talking about his understanding of that system. And so it comes from us. This is not something outside of us that some young white person has created that feels far away. This is something that comes from our heritage. And so, as well as indigenous heritage. And so we go into those conversations with our farmers, and to make it accessible. Like you said, some of you have talked about the accessibility of language, cultural significance of language, and how we approach. And so the impacts right now, because of, you all have pointed to the disinvestment and the kind of harm that has happened. There's been a lot of harm, the harm to the soil and the harm to the people. And so that harm reverberates, and it comes with it a lack of trust. And so even me as a Black woman walking onto the land with these Black farmers, the first thing they want to know, like, what are you here for? Right? And so it takes time. It takes time to build trust, just like it takes time to build a healthy relationship with the soil. It takes time for the soil. It takes time with relationship. And one of the biggest problems with our system that we have, and this, and again referring to a capitalistic system that we have, is that when you talk about regenerative, there's seeds, right? There's cover crops, there's seeds, the cost of seeds, the cost of no-till equipment, the cost of how do we terminate, how do we terminate the crop? There's all these parts to it that require capital, and that is not very abundant in these communities and with these farmers. And so those are some of the things that I have found. And they've got to hear, like, why should I do this? And I heard Portia, your description of, and I'm looking as fast as I can. I want to get that PowerPoint from you, to, everything that were penciled out positive. And at the same time, you get these models, and then you're on the ground, it's like a whole other story, you know? I mean, I'm a farmer, and I know what it's like last year when it was the hottest year on the record in Louisiana, and we lost everything. And we're not the only farm that did. Everybody, we lost everything. So right after that, I pumped in a big infrastructure, right? A nonprofit, raised the money, and I put in a new well, I put in big irrigation, I did all these things ready for the next time. And then this summer came, and it was so rainy, I couldn't get into the fields. It was too much rain, too much water. I was ready for no water. So, the reality of farming is really, it's hard and it's wonderful at the same time. And, you know, working with farmers, and that's why it's so important that people with capital who work with farmers talk about flexibility. It's got to be real, basically. It's got to take into consideration what happened with the weather and climate this particular season. A farmer cannot pull something out of nothing. And so these are the things that are, but yet if you have this bottom line, and this is when the money's due, and this is what you have to pay at this particular time, and you can just it's instead of helping, you're creating harm. So there's a lot that I can say about where the problems lie, and I'm from California, which is the organic haven. And I had an organic business in California. It was so easy. I get to Louisiana and I'm trying to do organic, and everybody says, people don't care about organic. And I'm like, that can't be true. But there is no financial upside to organic production. And so the education of the public is such a big part of it. The consumer has to be educated. And so when I look and I talk about, going organic, which is a whole nother thing, but that's another thing I want to talk about. But the idea of it, where is the financial upside really? You see the numbers, but does it really materialize like that? It doesn't in my home right here. I'm charging the same prices as the conventional farmer because that's what I can get. So there's a lot of reality on the ground. 90% of Black farmers are in the South. And the South is where organic is like, really, am I going to pay more for that? So there's a lot. The ecosystem has to be educated, including particularly the consumers. When I think about organic and going organic or going regenerative, like I said, the cost, the applications, oh my gosh, Mark, you pointed to that. If there is not an enterprise that can sit down and really take care of the applications for farmers, it's not going to happen. I happen to be very fortunate. I showed up on a farm that was already organically certified. But in addition to that, we still had to get our own organic certification. I couldn't pull it off for a long time. Finally, I got enough money to hire a operations person. I said, your job, your one and only job is to bring in organic certification. And that is what she did, because I paid her a good salary to do only that. And it took a while for her to pull that in, and she did it. Now, I'm one of the fortunate ones who was able to hire someone to do that. That was their only job. What farmer do you know can do that? It's a huge lift, any of these certifications. And if you don't have someone helping, it's just almost as nearly impossible. So there's so many barriers, all these different barriers, right? And yet, when I look at my young Black farmers that I'm working with, they are doing practices. They're just inherently doing it. They're not certified. They don't care to be certified, you know? And a lot of people, I'm certified only because I really need it to be, but do I really care about it? There's something about being certified that is also nefarious at the best. I mean, it's just, there's a racket to it that all the farmers feel, most farmers feel. You know, I'm just being real, y'all, and being very transparent about what this process is and how farmers feel about it. And so some farmers, and so particularly, but again, there are a lot of my farmers who are just doing regenerative practices on their own because that's how they want to farm. They don't want the chemicals. They know about rotation. They are learning about soil. And so, but it's the older farmers that are the ones that are the hardest for me that I have found in my ecosystem of farmers. And so, but we at our farm, we do it all, right? We're not at no-till yet, but we do low-till. We have a no-till plot and we have very low-till. We have, I've just invested in thousands of dollars of cover crops. I have the no-till drill to put it in, and I lend that drill out to everybody. That drill goes around the South, everywhere, to every state that I'm in, because no one has one. No-till drill, which sows the seeds, and then we do the rotation. Of course, we do companion planting. We do all kinds of things, and we also have what we need also to terminate the cover crops. And those are expensive pieces of equipment that you only use not very often within a year. So an equipment trust, that's one of the things that we're doing with Pot Liquor Capital, which is my sister organization, Pot Liquor Capital and Jubilee Justice. We have put together something that we call an equipment trust, where we are figuring out how to raise the money so that these farmers who have such a lack of resources can share equipment. Sharing equipment, that's a whole other thing when people need it at the same time. I mean, we're working a lot. There's a lot of kinks in it, but it is the answer. And a co-op is the answer. We have created a cooperative. Cooperative, cooperative, cooperative. I believe it in my heart. It is absolutely the antithesis to the current capitalist system that is working very well for those it's meant to work for and working very well for those it's meant not to work for. And so our cooperative is a way of saying it's not about me, but it's about we. And we know that we all do better when we come together rather than this hyper individualistic kind of way of thinking and being. That's not true anyway, because no one does it by themselves. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's where I love farming. As crazy and mad as it is, I really appreciate everyone on this panel, everything that you have said. Thank you for putting this panel together. This has been awesome. And I really hope that those people out there who are farmers or in the ecosystem of farmers are really taking this all to heart and getting on the ground with the farmers, get on the ground with the farmers and really, show up. You got to show up on the farms. You got to get dirty and find out what's really going on, because it's very different than what you think when you're, writing about it. I just say, do the best you can to get on the ground with the farmers. So I don't know if there's anything else you want me to talk about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Conda, for so eloquently bringing to the forefront like the boots on the ground perspective. And also, I would like for the audience to think about this panel as a whole. And now let's start and think about what Conda just said and back it up. She brought out some very important barriers that aren't always covered in the conversation, and they don't show up on enterprise budgets, but they are still very much barriers that have a cost that producers have to take into consideration when they're thinking about this transition. So how can philanthropy help overcome those costs? How can alternative finance systems, and how can us as economists help to bring it all together and help farmers to outline, okay, how can we look at this and look at your bottom line to make sure that you're still in a position where you can operate your farm at a profitable level? And I think that is very important. I want to first and foremost thank all of our panelists today. I have learned so much from each of you. We've all had separate conversations, but I really enjoyed today's panel. And again, I think it's a very important component that is not being talked about enough. I'm not going to spend the rest of the time of the panel talking because I really want to get into the Q&A and what some of our guests that are in the audience, they have questions for you, but also any insights that they want to provide, because they're also working with farmers. They're also researchers. They're also working in, the banking system or finance and economics. We want to hear from you also. And so I will kick us off with one of the first questions in the chat from, I don't know if mine shows the same as everybody else's, but the first question is for Conda from Dorothy Supat. Thank you, Conda, for speaking to the cultural, social, and relationships imperative to making a transition possible in partnership with the economic considerations. Okay, so that was a statement. Next question would be from Kelly Young. Discussion around transition to regenerative agriculture often points to education of the consumer. Who should lead that effort, and how might that education be delivered? And I think this is something that can be opened to all of the panelists to answer that question.
I can say, I can jump in a little bit. I
Okay.
think there's, I'm trying to remember the company, big dairy company, Danone. And I think it was General Mills as well, has had a initiative to have so many acres of land become organic and regenerative with the farmers that in their supply chain. They have a big voice. They have a big platform. And I think that those who have, from the smaller voices to the larger voices, they can just do any kind of promotion that they want to do with the kind of finances that they have and the platform that they have. So I think that that's one way. I mean, excuse me, when where do we get our information? Where do we get our information? And so some of it is a lot of it obviously is now social media. And I just think that on the level of the farm and social media, there is a lot of talk but of course I'm in social media in this ecosystem, a talk about regenerative and all of the benefits and the practices. But I do think that on the larger level, these multi corporations who have access to so much are able to really shed a light and really educate the public on what it means and why it's important. And so, and starting with the little people who are reading the cereal box, right? They're reading the cereal box at breakfast. And why are we not educating them on that cereal box? That's what I think we need to do.
I agree, Conda, and I think that's a great question, Kelly. And also when we're thinking about educating consumers, thinking about making sure that all consumers have access to the information. Because again, it goes back to the haves and the have-nots to a certain extent. And I think that education starts very young. Again, Conda, you mentioned, with our little ones, but also, I think adequate funding of some of the more traditional avenues like 4-H. I was a 4-H kid, and all of those traditional agricultural avenues that provided us with information and learning about our food system and what we intake into our bodies is very important in getting our younger generation, specifically minority young people, children, into those types of programs, or even starting them ourselves to start that educational aspect young and making sure that we are passing along information as we can within our communities to help educate folks. And, we were in Montgomery a couple of weeks ago and we talked about like access to information around the importance around organics and making sure that folks understand what that means for them and their communities. And I think that is the starting point. But who's responsible? I think we all are. We all have to take that responsibility on and passing on that knowledge to those that are around us in our direct circles and indirectly. David, your hand is up.
I was, I'm on. I was just going to mention the Regen Brands Institute. I know that, brands and food products are one interface by which consumers kind of learn about food and learn about some of these, emerging or kind of reimagined ways that we interface with food and what we eat. And I'll just put the link in the chat that for those who kind of are working from the brand side, the Regen Brands Institute is a great place to kind of engage in some of those activities around the education and how to help to inform around kind of what all of the benefits of regenerative and agroecology are.
Thank you. Next question we have, it says, for all the people attended the event, there did not seem to have many underrepresented farmers or BIPOC farmers in the event. Do you have any justification how to build a better connection to assist farmers who do not get information about these events or do not have resources to attend these events? I'm assuming, Ms. Liang, you're talking about this particular webinar. So I'll speak from the perspective of one who helped set this up. So this particular event or this series of webinars is an open public convening to farmers as well as different stakeholders. But one of the reasons we do recognize that farmers are very busy. And by this being in the middle of the day, they may not have access or the time to get on the call, which is why it's very important that we send out the recordings afterwards. We have a public website where farmers can go back and look at it. I also have my website on Freedman Airs where we put information, also putting it in webinars. We are constantly making sure that the producers on our mailing list at our respective organizations have access to this information, which is why we're pulling this convening together. And as far as how to build a better connection to assist farmers, that's typically in the work that we do every day, where we are taking the information that we find and know to be beneficial to farmers and making sure they have access to it. Either that's by some farmers, I call them, I text them, I send them emails. So we look at all types of modalities to make sure that we get the information out to farmers and producers. Dr. Odom, your hand is up.
Yes, I had one comment that I was really inspired by Conda's overview, but the I think the theme kept coming up in that we need a flexible ecosystem that enables, right? And I think that Conda's point around the role that companies or industry partners can play in this space is really important. She recognized two partners of FAR, General Mills and Danone, but there are others that really can, take a leadership role, but recognizing that it isn't just the role of the farmer to adopt, but that there's a role of all of us to create this a system that can enable. It's the role of research organizations and folks like Dr. Collins coming up with the models, but also going out in the field. It's the finance, it's the farmers themselves. Like it's a whole ecosystem that needs to be created and supported. And I feel like that I kept hearing throughout a number of the presentations, if not all of the presentations, is like making sure that we have this ecosystem. So even things like Mark's work in enabling folks to apply for funds, because that in and of itself is a labor burden that, funding organizations, I don't think mean to set that up, but it can become very challenging. So I think for me, it was just, I wanted to just note that I was really struck by and really excited to hear folks mentioning the ecosystem aspect of it and the reality that there are multiple players that could have a leadership role in this. And it isn't just all on the producer to why won't you adopt, but it's on all of us to create systems that encourage and enable them to do this work that they want to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Odom, for those insights. Take the onus off of the farmer. Their job is to farm, and they're doing a great job at it. Conda, we have another question for you. How does the need to be organic, if you are a regenerative producer, impact or become feasible for livestock producers?
Livestock, yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know much about livestock producing. I am also a vegetarian and I don't eat meat and I stay away from that part of the sector to tell you
Can,
the truth.
can you
Um,
repeat the question, Seneca?
so the question is, how does the need to be organic, if you are a regenerative producer, impact or become feasible for livestock producers?
Yeah,
Now,
I don't know the
I
sector.
will ask Ellen for a little bit of clarity, but I will say from the way the question is stated, it doesn't have to be a either or. Are you asking how does the need to be organic help in the feasibility for livestock producers and making sure that, if you want to be a organic livestock producers, any inputs that go into feeding the animal also have to be organic as well, so that you can certify that product at the end as an organic product. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on the question that you're asking. So if you can add just a little bit more clarity on that, and we can circle back to your question. I'll be happy to take a shot at it.
Seneca, there is an interesting comment in the chat around the need or the future for organic or regenerative indoor farming. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any experience in that, but I think that that's also a really interesting concept in that our organization also focuses on urban or indoor agriculture, but how does that play into the context of this transition conversation we're having today?
Good question.
Yeah, I was just looking at that and thinking about it. There's so much conversation around it. There's different kinds of indoor farming. So I'm not sure what kind of indoor farming you're speaking of. Um, but I know that, there's the hydroponic indoor farming. There's a huge discussion around that and whether it is organic or not. And it being certified organic is a big issue for a lot of farmers because it has nothing to do with soil. And soil is what is at the core of organic for a lot of people. So the discussion and the argument actually between hydroponic farmers and soil farmers is a big one. As it pertains to like one of the things that we're doing is getting high tunnels, because you're right, the climate is crazy. And the more control you can have, the better. And so right now I have 2 high tunnels and I need to get, and this morning we're looking at, okay, I need to get 2 more high tunnels. I mean, I could see that eventually becoming a high tunnel farm, which is still in the ground, but having a little bit more control over the environment. The cost of high tunnels but again, the EQIP program, they will pay, you have to put it up front and then they will reimburse you. If you qualify, I don't qualify for the EQIP program. I make a little too much for the EQIP program, but not enough to have everything I need. So I'm in that middle space where I can't get the EQIP money. And yet I need more high tunnels because that I'm looking at the fact that the growing that we're doing in the high tunnel versus outside of it is like night and day. It's so much better. So I agree that, when we are going to have to, that climate and just the high tunnel is a lot better than, I don't know what, when you talk about indoor, it sounds like you're talking like how hard building indoor. And that typically leads to hydroponics. And I'm just not, yeah, there's a lot of controversy around hydroponics and being organic or regenerative that some people say is impossible because there's no soil.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Conda. Another question from the Q&A: how can cooperatives help in terms of covering transition costs for regenerative or organic certification? And second part of it, would a supply cooperative make help to support those startup costs? So the first part is, can cooperatives help with the cost of regenerative organ certification, or would it be feasible for a supply co-op or a service co-op to help with those startup costs?
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm taking up all the space here. I can tell you that one of my cooperative, so we have a co-op, and one of the people in my co-op, one of the farmers, is in another co-op. He's in several co-ops. And one of the ways, there's so many ways to do a co-op, but one of the ways that they're doing is that it's a group of farmers, all in, not that far from each other. And they have decided that one farm they're going to farm on together. So they chose one person's farm. And once a week, they all come together and they work on that person's farm. And they bring their finances together on that person's farm. And so that person's farm, one of those things could be, let's do this farm organic. Let's go to organic. Let's do transition. As a group, we are putting our effort into this farm. And then as that comes to fruition, they move to another person's farm. And so it's kind of the old way of doing things that we did, many years ago, right? That our ancestors did. We work together in one area, we build a building, we build a home, and then we move to the other one and we build the next home. It's sort of like that. And so they're doing that right now as we speak, and it seems to be working. So that's one way. But people, again, you have to be selfless. You have to be in a space of a whole nother headspace than what we have been trained in this country. It's like you really have to have that sense of we-ness, and knowing that we are all uplifted. And when that farm becomes organic and they all work it, and they still have their own farms, but they go together once a week and they work that farm, that the produce that comes from that goes to everyone and it uplifts everyone. So that's one way to do it, and that's happening.
Thank you, Conda. David, did you have your hand up? Did you want to speak to that question?
No, I mean, I can point, if anything, to the University of Wisconsin Center of Cooperatives that really does a lot of cooperative development. And I know that there are cooperatives, especially in the state of Wisconsin, are a real foundational part of our agricultural ecosystem. And there are many places outside of Wisconsin as well that, would benefit from that kind of structure. So, for whether it's something that other states and cooperative extension programs can help to, provide, especially that technical assistance that's necessary to get new cooperatives up and running, but especially for on the production side, for producers to begin to aggregate and coordinate. Cooperatives really seem to be a great tool in the toolbox from a structure perspective to really kind of share and de-risk some of the production risk that and market risk that one may face.
Thank you, David. Mark, I think the next question is for you. Any recommendations for funders that would be willing to grant funds to start a revolving loan fund?
Yeah, and I actually say probably David, as I know, has approached many funders about this very question, so he might be the best one to
David.
talk about this. I'll just quickly say that revolving loan funds seem to be a little bit of a nice hot topic right now. I've spent quite a bit of time in the water world, and the EPA state revolving loan funds have been an incredibly great tool for helping support water systems and thinking creatively about water. My old employer, the McKnight Foundation, had essentially a revolving loan fund to help support fragile lands around the Mississippi River. So it has been used. We've approached different funders about having some sort of a disadvantaged farmer loan fund in order to help the purchase of farmland. So I think that's another aspect. But and when I think there's some momentum that's starting to roll for there. But I'll turn it over to David. I think Ellen, the other thing would be interesting is to know what specifically you're looking for in terms of the funding, because that depends quite a bit.
I mean, I think my answer would be it depends where you are, what kind of support is needed, what would it be used for? I mean, I think that the philanthropy sector, and I would say the public funds as well. Mark mentioned the state revolving loan funds. I think that there, I think now and in the future there are opportunities for USDA and other agencies to get into this space as well. And one resource I can point to is the Council for Development Finance Agencies has specific coursework and curricula around developing revolving loan fund. So that may be a resource to check out as well.
Thank you so much, David. I want to transition to Dr. Collins. I want to pitch this question to you. I think it is in regards to the example of the budgets that you put up. So the question is, why do you think you found variable results? Was the result from a difference in MLRAs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think throughout the literature, from what we're seeing from these examples, is that as I mentioned at the beginning, regenerative agriculture is a very individualized approach. You really have to take into account your particular farm. And so what we're seeing is that it really varies based on the types of practices that farmers are adopting. Whether you adopt only, say, no-till, you may have less positive results, right? You may have negative returns versus if you adopt, say, no-till in combination with cover cropping, you may see a more positive returns in that effect. So the combination of practices that are being adopted, the experience of the farmers. So how experienced is the farmer in cover cropping? Do they understand the type of seeds that will work best with the soil content that they currently have? Do they understand their current soil quality? So all of these different factors play into us getting varying results in terms of how effective these practices are going to be. Um,
Dr. Collins, I would also like to piggyback off of that question for you. So, in terms of like your budgets and thinking about it from, you pointed out all size, all farms are not the same. But when we look at it, from a general standpoint in agriculture, folks typically talk about commodity crops, and then is every other group they kind of lump together. What are your thoughts, or what are you're thinking about when it comes to commodity crops and the costs associated with transitions versus, let's say, produce or specialty crops and that cost of transitioning? Because that's something I'm very interested in knowing about.
this is a little weighted question.
Sorry.
A lot of the support tends to be for commodities. So that's one aspect, right? So if you're producing a specialty crop like fruits and vegetables or nursery products, for example, you may not have as much support in transitioning and tackling or recouping those initial investment costs that you have. I will say that one of the things that I found in looking at some of the data is that the adoption of reduced tillage tends to be higher in the Northeast, where we see less commodity crops and more of these nursery crops and specialty crops and things of that nature. And these are typically smaller farms as well. So I think that plays into effect as well. So there are some differences there, a little bit harder to recoup those initial investment costs. But at the same time, I think it could be just as beneficial under the right circumstances.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I could say something there as well, is that, we've focused a lot of the conversation here around the production side, but I think it's, the way that, these systems work is that you have to work on the supply and the demand and work on them simultaneously. And you begin to look at kind of whether it's, there have been corporate actors that have been mentioned, there have been brands that have been mentioned, but I think that, there's some real opportunity, whether it's around institutional purchase, school food programs, corporate food programs. We could really begin to send signals to the marketplace that these are the kinds of products that we want. They are, better for the environment. They are better for people. And, and we need to figure out what the economics need to look like so that they become more accessible, that we're valuing all of the positive and negative externalities, from both, from different kinds of production systems, so that we can, create these systems that encourage and allow for and prioritize and incentivize, these types of food products and landscape management strategies that are going to really benefit on the private side and on the return public benefits as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lazax. Yes, Dr. Collins. I think your hand went up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, and piggybacking off of what David mentioned, there is a need for more data with respect to the benefits and the costs associated with these practices. One of the challenges that I found, and Conda mentioned this in her presentation, is there's a lot of sort of publication bias with respect to positive results. When I was looking for scenarios or examples of, say, minority farmers, they were few and far in between. For small farmers, they were few and far in between. So we need to, I guess, encourage record keeping, encourage the keeping of these types of enterprise budgets or even partial budgets, and thinking about how you're going to adopt these practices, and share that information in a way that makes sense, so that we can learn, what does work on a small farm, what does work when we're producing fruits and vegetables instead of corn and soybeans. So the lack of information, readily available data, and examples from different types of farmers is a challenge with respect to conducting these types of analyses and understanding what's the best way forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we have a question that can be open to any of the panelists. Is there any emerging research on measuring the impact of transitioning to regenerative agriculture on farmers' health, wellness, or overall socioeconomic status? And I think you touched a little bit on that, Dr. Collins, in the need for more data, and more actually doing the work or the research behind and looking at some of these areas such as farmer health and wellness included in an economic model. But I will open the floor to all panelists to provide your perspective on that question.
Maybe I'll just mention that there is, I believe the University of Nebraska is, I can't remember if it's the Water Research Center or a public health center, has been doing some work, which is always controversial when you touch on these topics around toxics in drinking water supplies. And I think Indiana University has something as well in their medical school that was documenting some of those impacts that is clearly beyond the farmer, but in affecting rural communities as a whole. But that's one aspect that I think is raising some eyebrows about some of the toxicity issues that we have in our groundwater. I'll pass it on to others.
Okay, thank you, panelists, for your perspective on that. Dr. Odom, do you have any questions, or Suzanne, any questions for the panelists? I don't want to take up all of the time if there are any pressing questions that either of you ladies might have.
I have one, but I think Dr. Collins started to touch on it because I noticed that, I'm always looking for research gaps, right? That's what our organization's interested in at FAR. So you talked about the need for data, need for more of these enterprise budgets for small or minority farmers. But I wonder, are there any other big research gaps? I saw the data you presented was very much focused on like commodity. So how do we get a better understanding of what's happening outside of that space, which is where a lot of our minority farmers sit? And so just wondering if you are aware of, or if you can just, put out into the world, like what are some of the research needs that you're seeing that would enable us to be better providers of guidance or support? Again, thinking about this ecosystem of enabling, right? Some of that is just information. So that was my question.
That's I'll try to do this succinctly. I think sort of the data gaps there, we've kind of pointed out. But another thing that was mentioned were some of these outside or non-economic factors that influence the farmer's decision making. So there needs to be more research and understanding, okay, if say a partial budget says this is going to be a positive result, why would someone not adopt? Or what is needed to push something forward if say the partial budget assumes that if there's going to be a negative result, what do we need to get over that particular line? Is it going to take some collective action, cooperative work, similar to what Ms. Conda had mentioned, better understanding the time horizon that it takes in order to see positive results, and what can be done in the interim, because a lot of these farmers, as we mentioned, have limited resources. What can we do in the interim to help these farmers to make it to where they've at least recouped their costs and are now earning positive profits? So improving farm survival rates in a general sense. How can regenerative ag and these movements towards climate smart agriculture, how can that be used as a way to help these farmers gain into niche markets, for example, in terms of marketing their products? So those are a few. There's plenty.
Thank you so much. Suzanne, do you have any thoughts or any pressing questions?
Oh, this has been such an incredible discussion. All the questions that I have end up being asked, and then also answered extremely well and with phenomenal information that I haven't heard elsewhere before. So I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists. And through the course of these webinars, which this is the last virtual one, we've been so fortunate to be blessed by a tremendous audience that joins us in the conversation and contributes resources and ideas and points to new research needs. And that I hope as we wrap up this series, we're able to find ways to continue engaging with the full community and really driving towards solutions, because I think a lot of the ideas and the questions that are being raised, they're ones that multiple, if not all of us have, that we share. We share these ideas, we see the same needs. And when we continue to just encourage and support each other and saying, yes, this is a big gap that can help a lot of people and it can solve important problems, I think we're more likely to get to those solutions faster. So that's what I'm going to be focused on, is seeing how it can contribute to continuing to support the incredible efforts of everyone involved, the panelists, and also those of you who have joined in the audience. And thank you so much to Seneca for your leadership and your excellent facilitation today.
Thank you all. And I want to say that before we conclude today's webinar, and there's a series of, 4 webinars that we're completing with today, I want to leave some space for the panelists if they have any takeaways or points that they want to say before we end at the top of the hour. I want to leave space for that. I think it's very important because we do have experts with us today that have been providing us with valuable insights. And so I just want to leave space for that. If any of the panelists have any last remarks, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I do. I think that there's something that Mark said that really caught my ear, and it's the idea of restoring, telling the story. Our farmers are one of the things that we haven't talked about that is rarely ever talked about is the spiritual side of farming and what it means to farmers, the ancestral side, the long family lineage side, why they are farming, where all of it is coming from, and the stories at the heart of why we're farming is really a critical part of looking at a holistic. We have to do a holistic look. This is not just a data point. This is a human being who has an ancestral, that land, they have a connection to a land. They may have lost half of it, most of it. They may have regained it. They may have all kinds of relationships with the land. And so this other part of it is, I think, is a crucial area to tap on. And when you talked about restoring, I just loved that word, Mark, and I want to know offline more about that, because it is the stories. It's the stories that we tell. It's the stories that keep us going. It's the stories that why we're out there, why, that particular crop is the crop that I'm growing. And so all of that has to be a part of what we're talking about if we're going to look at the whole person, the whole human. If we're looking at part of it and we're only talking to part of them and we're trying to convince them of something and they've got this other story that has legacy, that has ancestral, that is something else that they may not say, but that's what's motivating them, you know? So I'm just saying that this is what I'm seeing in the field. This is what I'm seeing in the field. And it's a real important part to bring forward or to take heart in and to understand that there's so much more going on than what meets the eye. So I want to learn about your restoring.
Wonderful. Thank you, Conda. Mark?
Yeah, and I'm realizing I feel like I'm foolish trying to follow what Conda with that wisdom just said. Um, I would 100% agree, and I love what you're saying about story. I love what you're saying about spirituality and how that component. And I say all this, I'm a white environmental engineer is how I started my career, and I feel like I have slowly gone further and further away from data and further away from feeling like the solutions will be by tweaking the system. And it has been because of people like my colleague Brett Ramey that I mentioned before, who is really the visionary that created restoring regenerative agriculture. Um, for him, when I approached him about doing work for the Regenerative Ag Foundation, he was saying, well, that word regenerative and that word or agriculture, they don't really fit into the context that I'm in with indigenous agriculture. And from his lens, you're saying that there's a concern that regenerative is just kind of a makeover of traditional ecological knowledge. And agriculture was a little too confining from the broader way that he speaks of food production. And so I think this was a common ground that made him feel comfortable with talking about restoring regenerative ag and to say that we are not comfortable just in the definition that's often used for regenerative ag and want to have something broader that is inclusive of the whole person, that's inclusive of the spirituality that's there. And I feel like I've just been on a learning journey of my 30-year career of just learning how much I don't know. And it's been so helpful to be in spaces like this and to be in spaces with people from different backgrounds. And that's really, and I really mean that we need to get out of the dominant paradigm is not working. We need to get out of it. And there is no better way of doing that than to learn from our elders and the wisdom that's there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those words, Mark. Dr. Collins or David, do you have any last thoughts you would like to share with us today?
Sure. Um, I was actually thinking a couple of things after Lakeisha had posed the last question, around, especially some of these gaps in research and gaps in understanding. I think, clearly we're gonna, as a community, need to look at this from qualitative and quantitative angles. The qualitative really about, what Kanda and Mark were just talking about. And, more on the quantitative, I think that, I think as part of this conversation, we've really kind of looked at all of the different angles, both the environmental, the human health, the economic development, um, of a more kind of holistic, system and way of doing agriculture. And just a couple of pieces to point to. The Organic Trade Association did some research, I think about a decade ago at this point, with Penn State University looking at organic hotspots, and they showed that in those hotspots, the median household income was $2,000 over than some of the non-hotspots, and those counties where they identified some of these hotspots had a poverty rate that was almost 1.5 points lower than surrounding areas. Similarly, some work that the Global Alliance for the Future of Food led a couple of years ago used the true cost accounting methodology to look at kind of differences in these systems. And I think it's going to be kind of holistic tools like those that are able to, I mean, it's really hard to put a value on everything. I'll be the first to say that, but at least to try to put things in relationship with each other to, again, get this more holistic understanding where we could then begin to shift policies, shift markets, shift dialogue, shift the storytelling, that I think is incorporated in at some level in some of these, I would say, more quantitative tools like true cost accounting, but again, nonetheless important in really helping to reframe or to go back and look at some of these more traditional types of agriculture where I think, so much rich value has been generated. And I think we've, tend to have stripped out many pieces of agriculture over the last centuries to, really focus on quality or quantity and, really moving more towards a quality and holistic frame in the agriculture of the future.
Thank you, David. Dr. Collins, do you have any last thoughts?
The one thought that came to mind as we were speaking was a need to foster trust throughout this system that we're talking about, both on the producer side and on the consumer side, with respect to um, encouraging farmers to reach out to receive access to some of these resources and information that is available, and in particular with these institutions feeling comfortable to even go out and speak with farmers and encourage them as well. So I think that trust is an important aspect, and I think we need to figure out how do we build that trust within this system um, when thinking about this regenerative agricultural approach that we've been discussing.
Thank you, Dr. Collins, and thank you again to all the panelists. I will now turn it over to Dr. Odom. I think you're on mute, Dr. Odom.
Yep, I have to unmute myself. I think that honestly, it's just an expression of gratitude, and an excitement for what happens next. So I think that what the three partners, Free Mayors Foundation, RFF Researchers for the Future, as well as the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, we know that this webinar series was informative, but we also know that action needs to come behind it. So I think that the thing that I personally can commit to is that this won't be just a great series of webinars that sit on our website, but that we definitely will have some action following this and thinking about ways in which we can enable or at least continue to understand what some of the barriers are. And then the goal of understanding these barriers is to propose some solution, right? And I think one of the things that Suzanne did mention is that on each of our webinars, I've been so struck by how willing folks have been to share resources. So we know that that's one accomplishment of this, but also thinking about, are there some new partnerships, relationships, or engagements that we can create with the power of this brain trust, right? Of all these folks that are so passionate about this, such that we can actually incorporate lasting change and create that future state that I think each of the panelists has spoken about, right? The future state. What do we want to do from now? What change do we want to make? So I would say that one of the things I'm very excited about is I know the commitment of our three organizations is to move to a place of action as well. So I think we're in a learning stage and a design stage, but very much wanting you to stay engaged with us and recognize that anything else that comes of these conversations will be shared with the community at large. So just an expression of gratitude. And I will maybe leave the last word to our final partner, Suzanne. And other than that, I would just wish everyone a safe weekend, but not only that, a safe holiday season. If we don't hear from you before that, though most of you will at least get the recording and the recording of this, but just wishing everyone a safe and thoughtful and restful and restorative holiday season if you're into that sort of thing. And if not, just wishing you well rest. And Suzanne, you have the last word.
Oh, beautiful words, Lakeisha. That's perfect to close on. Thank you all so much for joining us and for your generosity of time. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
y'all.
all.
Have a
Have a
wonderful day.
great weekend.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone. Thank